And we're live now. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, and I'll be your host today for, inshallah, the wonderful book talk that we have with Dr. Walaa Quisay, who is joining us from Scotland. Welcome, Walaa.
Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. Just as a matter of introduction, I'm just gonna introduce our speaker briefly, and then we're gonna launch into conversation about the book. So, Dr. Walaa Quisay is a Leverhulme. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Leverhulme.
Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. She is the author of Neo-traditionalism in Islam in the West, Orthodoxy, Spirituality, and Politics, which is the book that we are discussing today, published by Edinburgh University Press. She is also co-author of When Only God Can See, the Faith of Muslim Political Prisoners. She worked at numerous academic institutions, including the University of Manchester, the University of Birmingham, and Istanbul Sehir University. In 2019, she received her DPhil doctorate degree from the University of Oxford at the Faculty of Oriental Studies. Her research interests include the anthropology of religion, the study of Muslim political and religious subjectivities, carceral theology, theodicy, spirituality, and traditionalism and modernism in contemporary Islamic thought. So, Dr. Walaa, we have in front of us a really interesting book today, and one that I would say has generated a considerable interest because of the topic. Because a lot of people, especially for Muslims living in the Western countries and especially in the Anglo-American sphere, they can relate to a lot of things that you write about in the book. So before we go deeply into the book, and the book is about this Anglo-American sphere, the revival of traditional Islam within a certain segment of Western Muslim populations, and led by charismatic Muslim scholars of also Anglo or Anglo-American origin that you will tell us more about. But before we go into all of that, I want to ask a question that I ask of every single guest in our book talk series, and that is, why did you write this book, and what is the book's main argument?
Well, thank you so very much for this really kind introduction. The book actually started as my PhD project, and it wasn't a purely disinterested academic pursuit. I had some questions, and as a Muslim, I wanted to do my best to answer them. I was a young person that was reflecting on her own faith, and I shared many of the neo-traditionalist questions about the impact of modernization on Islamic knowledge production, spirituality. And my friends shared these same questions as well. And so this is really where my interest became, really started. And when I started my PhD, I was very much interested and continue to be on the question of politics of space and its relationship with subject formation. So in very layman's terms, I wanted to understand how spaces were conducive to our acceptance of certain knowledge. My supervisor at the time, Dr. Muhammad Talib, he introduced me to this concept of plausibility structures, which really helped me understand how we think, what we think, where we think. But this was in 2015. And so while I was working through the project, certain questions that I hadn't really been asking myself because there was no need to came up through my work. So there were many arguments, many findings in the book, but I have three main findings that I like to highlight, and other findings I think, or other arguments, fall within sort of the rubric of these three main points. So the first point is regarding the notion of tradition in of itself. And since it has a very authoritative potency, I wanted to understand what is this notion of tradition that the sheikhs constantly refer to. And in the book, I came to argue that it's not an objective claim. even if it is authoritative. Rather, it represents an antidote to the felt loss of modernity. And therefore, we can speak of Western values and Western tradition in the same way, or talk about the decline of the Western traditional values in the same way that we can talk about, the Kalam tradition and how Muslims have forgotten that. So there is that wider rubric of tradition. It is very much an ideological claim. And that the claim to this objective structure is actually very, very subjective, and it is also a cultural story. The second thing that I came to sort of understand or argue in the book, that neo-traditionalism is not unamenable to the imperatives of modern power. And that's for two reasons. First, the nature of modern power in the state in of itself. And the second reason is the lack of internal critique of these modern power structures when we think about the overarching critiques of modernity. So the last point is that this tension between the lack of critique of modern power structures and the amenability of neo-traditionalism to the imperatives of modern power leads seekers to a sense of burnout in some sections, but also it's not entirely sustainable. So it sort of lends itself to a form of secularity. So within particular spaces, the tradition can be performed, the tradition can be adapted for some people, but at the same time, when they leave spaces that are traditionalized, they can sort of imbibe different values and believe different things. So these are the three main findings that I've come to sort of the conclusion of the book.
Thank you so much. I think that's really kind of sets the stage for discussing the book. And the book, in a nutshell, just to give it kind of brief overview, is a study of these neo-traditionalist approaches to Islam that have become very popular in Western countries, and especially in Anglo-American sphere, in English-speaking Western countries, especially the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada to some extent. And in the book, you studied three major figures within that movement, or three major scholars within that movement: Hamza Yusuf, right?
Yeah.
Ahmed Abdallah, and Timothy Winter or Abdul Hakim Murad, right? And but not only that, you have also attended many of the events that they have organized, the neo-traditionalists, and you spoke to the attendees of these events. And I think this ethnographic kind of dimension of your book is really, really interesting to read, because people in their own words explain why they're there, but also explain some of the tensions that I think we will explore in our talk. So we have used the term neo-traditionalism quite a bit so far. I think it's time for us to define it. So please tell us, define for us neo-traditionalism, as hard as it is, and then tell us a bit about the context in which it emerged and the reasons for its rise.
Yeah, I mean, neo-traditionalism as a term is not without controversy. I mean, some scholars within the rubric of the, let's say, epistemic community have used it. Others do not like it. So I can just clarify how I am using it. So the very notion of tradition is theologically first placed within, Hadith Jibril regarding Islam, Iman, Ihsan, and the sciences that are purportedly deduced from the Islam, Ihsan, Iman, Ihsan tripartite. So that's the study of fiqh, aqidah, and tasawwuf. And these methods of traditional Islam were preserved in unbroken chains of transmission from student to teacher, all the way to the time of the Prophet. So that's the theological component to it. But then in one of my interlocutors' own words, he mentioned this revival So this is someone trying to explain what they believe this orientation to be. This revival of the tradition in the West is not abstracted from a traditional continuum. It is within it. We are not a generation who have found an encoded message that we decipher and then we reconstruct, but due to various socio-political conditions, the heirs of the tradition have been obscured. The proper Islamic tradition has been marginalized. So the continuum hasn't ceased, but it became inconspicuous. So now we have satellites in rural areas in Mauritania, Hadramaut, and places like Syria. These traditions have been preserved in communities, but they are on the fringes where they used to be in the center. So we have a few things that are going on here. We have a sort of historical narrative in which the tradition existed at a particular point of time and was central to our understanding of what Islam was, what our spiritual role was, and who we were as Muslims. And then you have the notion of this sort of rupture that occurred with modernity, even if it's not a complete rupture. So what that meant was that the centers are no longer the representatives of the Islamic tradition, rather certain spaces. So certain spaces are deemed to be outside this sort of modernist decline, and they become a representation of the tradition. So the tradition exists in time, theology, space, but it's also preserved in human beings who embody this tradition. And so these are the spiritual sages and the sheikhs who have inwardly and outwardly preserved the tradition and follow it. And so the neo-traditionalist sheikhs in the West have studied with these sheikhs, and through that chain, they become heirs of the tradition in the West in their attempt to sort of revive it or bring it to existence again with Muslim Western communities. So the reason I use the neo signifier here is that when tradition therefore becomes sort of positioned as this authoritative claim, the meaning sort of change depending on the crisis that they are responding to. So how we view modernity and what modern decline seems to be sort of draws the contours or reproduces how they construct what the tradition is. And that's why it's quite easy to talk about Western values as being harmonious to like the traditional Islamic ethos in a way. So that's sort of where how I would define neo-traditionalism and the neo signifier. The reasons for the emergence of neo-traditionalism, or I mean, scholars existed, and these scholars were going to build institutions, but the reason I think it became such a popular trend was they were asking very, very important questions that were left unanswered. There were institutional failures in Anglo-American communities. There were theological and epistemic questions that were left unanswered or not sufficiently answered. And they were explaining the failures of trends that had become popular at the time. So the failure of different iterations of political Islam, like regardless of how you would like to define that, the institutional and theological blunders of different Salafi trends. They answered questions in a deep and satisfying way in a time where other trends just did not.
Thank you. So I know that you struggled with translating it to Arabic, but after a long time struggle, what is the best term you could come up with for neo-traditionalism in Arabic?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. So I do mention this in the book. I had interviewed Habib Ali Jifri before when I was first starting out, and he didn't like. So I was conducting the interview in Arabic, and I tried to say taqlid, and taqlid does have a sort of theological implication, but also within the Arabic sphere, it's seen in a negative way. So he wasn't super happy about that. I mentioned turath, but Islamic turath, or the turath does not necessarily have a theological have defined it or have translated it as a turathiyun al-judud. What Habib Ali Jifri wanted to call the trend was al-madrasa al-asila, and that was a very, very interesting and very long debate in the 90s about al-asala wal-mu'asara.
I remember that. When I was in grad school, there was a lot written about al-asala and the whole issue of authenticity and so on. And it's interesting that he would choose that term.
Yeah. But the debate seems to have, it's not a continuous debate anymore, I think. And so I haven't seen anyone else use the term in that way now, but it does point to that there is a claim of authenticity that's embedded within the view of history, within the view of within the view of history and theology in a way, and in the critique of modernity.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because I remember reading that discussion in your book that you had with him, and I was just wondering if you settled on a term of how you would translate it into Arabic. And it also
I'm still struggling, to be honest.
Yeah, I thought about it, and I couldn't think of a good translation either. But it's also interesting because it tells us that the origins of the term are not from the Arab world, and that in and of itself presents some kind of difficulty of translating it back into Arabic. Now, in the book, you focus quite a bit, actually. The three protagonists of the book are, like I say, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Abdul Hakim Murad, and Amr Abdullah. So can you introduce them to our audience, and then tell us, why did you decide to focus on these three protagonists, as I call them?
So Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is a Muslim who converted to Islam when he was 17. He is from the United States. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad similarly converted to Islam as a young man. He is from the UK. And Sheikh Omar Farooq Abdullah is slightly older than the two. He's also an American convert to Islam. I think, so there were many reasons why I chose these three as the protagonists of the movement, even though there are other very influential people. I think, firstly, it was something that came from the sort of my ethnographic notes and accounts. These were the three main sheikhs that the young people seemed to resonate, and sort of they kind of drew different contours of their appreciation of this movement, whether it is the public facing, was Sheikh Hamza Yusuf definitely is, the intellectual. I mean, they're all highly intellectual, but Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad has a very, very academic sort of astuteness that attracts him, or the spiritual, which Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah kind of represents as a Sufi sheikh that many people do choose to take bay'ah with. So it began in that way. But the more that I looked into it, the more I saw that institutionally they were very, very significant to the movement. I mean, I remember I grew up partly in the UK, but not exclusively. I moved around between the Arab world and the United Kingdom. I also lived in the US for a little bit. But I remember I was very young when Rihla came on NBC, a Saudi-owned channel. And I remember these three sheikhs being, front and center of the movement. So it seemed to me that it made sense, but also that there's a kind of common thread between their thinking that really cemented like the big questions for me. And so I wanted to understand how each thought of these claims and what conclusions it sort of led to. And I mean, you kind of see in the book that some of the conclusions were very similar, and it led to similar sort of political and social comments and forms of activism, but not necessarily, you know. So that was something that was very, very interesting about these three sheikhs.
Thank you. So one of the ways in which you study neo-traditionalism in the book, actually there are two ways. One is through the institutions that these individuals have formed, but actually in your book, you focus on the other vehicle through which they disseminate their ideas, and those are the retreats that you just mentioned. So it is evident in the book that these neo-traditionalists have a complicated relationship with tradition and modernity. So if you could tell us a little bit more about this, I'm going to pack a few things in this one question, because I think it combines different issues that exist in a couple of chapters of the book, and I think it would be better if you maybe answer them all together at once. So they talk a lot about disenchantment, right? I was a student in the 90s at ISTAC with Naqib al-Atas, who is one of the big inspirations for Zaytuna and for Hamza Yusuf. And I remember three things that he always talked about: disenchantment of nature, deconsecration of values, and desacralization of politics. And this is kind of a neo-traditionalists take this as a starting point. But what was also interesting to me, that reading your ethnographic accounts with, conversations with people who attended these rihla events and retreats, is that there is also the aspect of the mystical or esoteric, and even something you could call it new age type of thing. And it reminded me of that great recent book, it's called The Myth of Disenchantment. That book actually shows that that disenchantment is a myth. It never happened. That in the modern age, people were constantly enchanted. They were just enchanted by different things, So it kind of comes out in your discussions with these people who attend these retreats. But the retreats also serve as a vehicle to inculcate the acceptance of authority and obedience among the attendees. The sheikhs knows the best. You're not there to complain, even if you are totally physically, mentally, and even spiritually exhausted. You're to keep quiet, and basically sheikh knows best, and there is no way you could question any of that. I know I packed a lot in these comments or questions about the book, but if you could tell us maybe some stories from your interviews, and you attended these retreats also, you were in some way not just observing, but you also sometimes participant to some extent. So it's a very good ethnographic account. So if you could unpack some of the things that I've just maybe talked about based on the impressions from your book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you brought up the myth of disenchantment. So it's something that I had mentioned in the dissertation, and it didn't make it to the book, but one of the very interesting kind of very small points that he makes in the book was that Weber actually, or he argued that Weber may have came up with the concept of disenchantment after during a healing retreat he was in Switzerland, where spiritualists and the Theosophical Society met, and he wrote a letter to his wife saying, "We're living in an enchantress place." And so he left the retreat, and later on he discussed disenchantment. And I thought that was such a fascinating point. I don't know what to make of it, but it's definitely compelling for me. I think when we think about modernity, to your first point, the interesting thing for me, or I think a very good conceptual tool we can sort of utilize to understand how modernity is critiqued and how the tradition is attempt to be revived or re-enchanted in a way, is that how they view the nature of crisis and chaos, right? So what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And how do we begin to retrieve a proper order of the world? So before I go into like talking about the spiritual retreats in of themselves, it's important to think that, you know, in the discourse, the post-colonial Muslim context and the post-Christian Western context have this commonalities, and sometimes the narratives of the post-Christian West impedes or overrides the Muslim particularity in many ways. So you have the Muslim seeker, the Muslim believer in the West, standing in between these two fallen realities, and in attempt to access a spirit that is no longer there. And at the heart of this is an implicit and sometimes a very, very explicit Weberian narrative of disenchantment. At times they refer to, you know, we live in the age where magic has disappeared. Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah mentions this a lot more explicitly than the two, but there is this embedded Weberian narrative, and sometimes there is a conjuring of Charles Taylor as a sort of explaining that, you know, there is this malaise in modernity in a way. So there are two reformations, the Western Protestant Reformation that had led to the secularization and the disenchantment of Western society. And this is the first step to what went wrong here, right? Our subjectivities have changed. The Western subject has changed. The Western subject believed that they could be their own priest. The church is decentered. The authorities are decentered. The cosmos and the world are essentially removed from one another, and we can explain things through purely mechanistic scientific approach. And then there's the Muslim context. You have the post-colonial context. You have the trauma that moves and shakes the post-colonial mind. The post-colonial mind is constantly traumatized by this experience of material and militaristic defeat. And so they abandon their own spirituality, their own sheikhs, their own tradition, and they look onto these pillars of science, right? And so this came by way of both, sometimes it's referred to as the Wahhabi intrusion, where, you know, people no longer go to the shrines and they're essentially disenchanted from these spiritual authorities, or sometimes it's they refer to, you know, the liberal Salafiyya movement, Muhammad Abdu, Afghani, and that whole sort of tradition, which inadvertently then led to Islamism, which further decentered Muslims' view of calamity. So there is this implicit theodicy in this whole thing, that Muslims are decentered, disenchanted, due to them idolizing their Western sort of colonial masters, and so the Muslim mind is traumatized by this, and so they have no access to their tradition anymore. So this disenchantment is very, very much present, right? And then we start thinking of sort of the retreats as this vehicle by which you can retrieve the past. And if we think of sort of tradition as something that has been moved from the center of the Muslim world to the fringes, whether it's in Mauritania, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, the retreats become an attempt to recreate these traditionalized pockets, right? And the sheikhs stand there as traditional sheikhs who have studied under sheikhs, all the way back to the Prophet. So there is this isnad that is in there, and these spaces are carved out of the societies that they're in. So the students may be in Istanbul, but they're not in the hustle and bustle of Istanbul. They don't go out to the city unless it's a part of a sort of activity or a trip to contextualize what this means to the wider narratives of decline in the modern world. So there is this re-understanding of geography, but at the same way, or in the same sense, these spaces begin to see modernity as an existential and intellectual other. So when you're within it, you can critique modernity and your own subjectivity as something that is not impeding on you. And so you have the power to reconstruct it. This is a very, very powerful, powerful tool, because you're not being you're not in the face of modern power in this very evident way. And so you can intellectually sort of break it down and try to find your spiritual, the spiritual meaning of your existence in a way. So it's extremely seductive, it's extremely powerful. And so the very conditions of what you would believe to be plausible outside of the space of the retreat changes. Now, this isn't the only thing that causes this disintegration. You have how the authority within the space is cemented, whether it's sort of through the intense routinization of time. The day starts at Fajr and usually ends at like 10 and 11 p.m. There are some breaks in between, but people are constantly tired, constantly trying to understand things that they haven't heard before. And so there's this constant need to keep up. So if there's something that you don't necessarily understand or you don't necessarily know, you're put in this places to, this isn't just an intellectual exercise, this is a spiritual exercise. How do I come to take on the spiritual self, this pious self, when I don't know necessarily what I believe? So there is this unmaking of subjectivity in this space. And so this is when politics becomes really interesting, because the space is avowedly like unmodern and unpolitical. So when political values come into the space, they come as a sort of spiritualization of politics, like you mentioned. So one example I like to use often is this idea of the power of dua, right? So one of the sheikhs had talked about the power of dua in enacting change in the material world. And as Muslim believers, you're put in this place as, do you believe in the power of your own actions versus the power of God's will? And so the dua is sort of God's will enacting change in the world. So one of the things that Sheikh Walid Mus'ad had mentioned, if Muslims were to go against this power of like political activism in which this was at the time of Donald Trump, to constantly decry Donald Trump and decry Netanyahu for their like actions, and just pray to God that God would rectify their internal states and maybe they could become Muslims, right? And maybe that will fix everything. And so as a believer in that space and someone wanting to, take on or embody this pious sense of self, well, of course, the power of dua is all encompassing. Of course, God can do that, right? But then there's a tension. Is that how things actually work? And so in this space, you have to navigate and negotiate what you wouldn't necessarily see as political sort of imperatives outside of the space. But in the space, there is a sense of it could make sense. So one thing one of my interlocutors had mentioned, we were talking about the role of race in the space of the retreat. And she mentioned that there were things that she had further questions and that things that were not necessarily things that she found comfortable in the space. And I asked her whether she was able to talk to any of the sheikhs about it. And she said, I didn't feel like I was knowledgeable enough or worthy enough to ask these questions, but in the space within our rooms, we discussed this, right? And so there's a sense that when you're within the space of like this public space of the retreat, knowledge is moved in a very authoritative way. But outside of that hegemonic power, within the rooms, the knowledge production or the knowledge becomes moves in different ways, and it's much more obvious when people go out completely outside of the space of retreat. Then things start to be negotiated, questions are asked. One of the things that I mentioned in the book when I went to the Spring Lodge retreat, and something that was personally very meaningful to me as a person who comes from an Egyptian background, was when Habib Ali Jifri was talking about the Rab'a massacre. So he'd mentioned that it wasn't actually the Egyptian, and this was in a spiritual devotional setting, it wasn't in a political setting, that it wasn't the Egyptian military who killed those people. It wasn't the Egyptian military who burnt the corpses. It was the protesters trying to frame the military with the complicity of the media. And so in that space, I went ahead and I asked questions. What do you think about what Habib Ali Jifri had said? And automatically the response was, I think you're misunderstanding the point that he's making. Habib Ali Jifri just said means, the modern media is a seditious tool, and then they went on to appeal to his authority. He is unlike Salafis because he's always smiling. He's unlike Salafis because he's spiritual. But then later on that night, I had the same discussion with many of the same people. And then they started asking questions. And it became very, very interesting that the space of the retreat, the devotional space, allows for different meanings to occur, allows people for radical unmaking of their own, of what they would believe. And by the way, this isn't just political. It goes in the matters of race and I mean, race is political, but gender, politics, and science even. Can I just say one last thing about
Sure, and then we can move on, because I think you already talking about political, which was going to be my next question anyway.
Okay.
But if you could maybe conclude this thing, because I saw a couple of comments on chat as well that I want to bring up before we move to the next question. So yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think the other point about spirit, the New Age, and retreats generally, is that there is a wider trend of spiritual tourism that some people are sort of embedded in, and you can see within seekers themselves there's a big divide on the issue of the New Age. The majority of seekers find that neo-traditionalism is a corrective to the spiritual but not religious approach of the New Age, while a small minority, even if it is quite intellectual, they come to think of tradition and the traditional authority of the sheikhs as a part of the spiritual marketplace in a way. So they believe in other things and include this approach within their wider sort of spiritual orientation.
Yeah, thanks so much. And one thing that I noticed among the what they call themselves, students of sacred knowledge, and that in and of itself needs unpacking. Sacred knowledge. I mean, again, if you try to translate it back, what is sacred knowledge? Or what it is? I mean, it's a category that doesn't exist, I think, in tradition, and yet is presented as traditional. That's just my editorial take on it. And I'm not saying this comes from your book, but that's just my understanding. But I wanted to take a couple of comments in the chat. Sana said, and since then she has retracted that message, but I think there was a suggestion to translate it as al-mu'asara with a fatha on sad, but that to me sounds much more like contemporariness. And it doesn't really convey the idea of tradition, but it's a kind of a good take on that. It's a possibility. And then we have another suggestion. Tina Levin said that I saw someone mention the book in an online post in Arabic, translating the title as Al-Madhhabiyya al-Jadida fil Islam, Al-Madhhabiyya al-Jadida. So
Yeah.
that's, I thought myself like al-muqallidun al-judud or something like that. But again,
That's good.
yeah, that sort of, in my mind, comes closest to how I understand it. But I can also understand why that could be questionable.
Mhm.
My sort of, if I were to translate, I'd probably call it al-muqallidun al-judud. But who knows? Um, Anyway, so you already started talking about the political, and this is where I get super excited. um, so in the metaphysical lens, which is a chapter in your book, you write about how neo-traditionalists connect metaphysical and political. So can you
Mhm.
break this down for us? This connection. On the one hand, they said there is a need to revive the metaphysical, but then that metaphysical also has a political component to it, but it's a very specific type of politics that it allows. So if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think when I was first working on this approach, again, like the term tradition, the term metaphysics kept on popping up. And I was at a conference and I talked a little bit about that. And someone who works on Ibn Hazm just stopped me a little bit, and he said, what do you mean when you say metaphysics? Because the way you're using it, it's very not, there isn't a precise way. And it that kind of clicked to me, that the use of metaphysics doesn't necessarily refer to a particular science, but is some sort of orientation that shows their critique of modernity and secularity in a way. And so the way that I've come to understand it is that so Sheikh Hamza Yusuf had mentioned this before. He talks about that with modernity, there was a decline in the way people connected and saw their metaphysical purpose in the world, right? They lost the metaphysical lens. And even though metaphysics as a science, no matter how we like to sort of translate it or understand it, was the domain of the elites, it was something that was embedded in the structures of society. It was translated in khutbah speeches, in the khutbah sermons, and in tariqa affiliations. So even if only the elites could discuss metaphysics as a sort of science, the metaphysical view of the world was embedded and imbibed by society in large. And that connects to everything from aesthetics, and that's why aesthetics becomes a very, very significant way in which they present a lot of their claims that there's a decline in beauty, that Muslims or just the world has gone to this modern profane art, and there isn't this metaphysical view. Architecture has become profane, which there is a very big argument to be made to that, but there is an inherent political element to that. And Hamza Yusuf calls this element the metaphysical lens. And by that, he basically refers to theodicy, right? The idea, the way that Muslims see their own suffering, right? And the way that Muslims saw their own sufferings in the tradition is very, very different than the way Muslims understand their suffering in the modern world. And that is due to the intrusion of politically oriented movements that are, even if they aren't Marxist, are coded sort of with Marxism in a way. And Marxism being the most anti-metaphysical ideology because it disorients us from a view of God in a way. And so this sort of metaphysical lens is a question of suffering, right? How do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with the violence perpetuated by political power onto you as an individual? Do you fight it? And when you fight it, that causes chaos, that causes dissolution, and authority, even if unjust, it has an embedded ability to sustain and spiritualize society, right? So the state, even if unjust, can allow for spirituality to flourish, whereas revolution has an inherently destructive force within it. So people nowadays ought to don't see the metaphysical purpose of tribulation, which is to kind of fix their internal states and find their way to spiritually grow and submit to God. But they want to take things into their own hands, and therefore sort of dissolving the structures that could have maintained society. And by the way, and this is also a critique of sort of Western society in a way that he shares with a lot of other conservatives. It's this idea that there was harmony before, and then these modern movements came and dissolved everything. And now when there was harmony, people kind of are always fighting each other. And that's really at the heart of all of it.
Yeah, and one could make a cynical kind of remark that they never saw a dictator they wouldn't embrace, right? And it's much easier to talk about, suffering and you have to suck it up, so to say, when you're sitting in California, Cambridge, or Chicago, than it is if you're in Cairo or Tripoli or wherever it is,
or parts of Chicago or parts of California as well,
True, but it's also interesting that the three protagonists we're talking about all come from upper middle class white Christian background, and that also imparts certain authority, which I think is also attractive to a lot of immigrant Muslims, because it sort of gives them an entry ticket. Being a Muslim, you're constantly an underdog. So now all of a sudden you can see yourself part of that kind of more white, upper middle class environment, and that's interesting. I don't want to go too far with this argument because I don't want to take us too far from the book, but I do have a couple more questions, but I think our audience deserves to be heard. So we have two questions here, one from Faiza Akova and the other from Nicole Carrera from Boston University. So let's start with Faiza's question because it's the first one that came. She said, thank you for this talk. Can you please unpack the link between neo-traditionalism and secularization? I think this is something you said in your first answer. You mentioned this. And what does this connection look like in the daily experiences of your participants? So the link between neo-traditionalism and secularization.
I mean, it's a very big question, and it's something that could be very contested in a way. But it goes back to what you were saying about sort of the inculcation of sort of, Muslims into a white American or Anglo view of the world. In a way, so within the space of the retreat, I call this the promise of whiteness. And by that, I mean, is that there's a sense that you can sort of shed your subjectivity, whether it's religious or political or whatever, within that space, and embrace a sort of metaphysical objectivity of a tradition. But then outside of the space of the retreat, certain things start impeding and you have to contend with it. And I think secularity, if we see it in terms of like the politics of space, you can embody the tradition within particular spaces. You can believe in all of the things that the sheikhs sort of argue for, but then outside of these spaces, it becomes more contested. And so what do? In the same way that you can be a Sufi within the space of the retreat and then go out and work your like bank job at the same way, So it allows for this spatial separation. And again, this isn't some like this isn't a way to sort of condemn people in one way or another. It's sort of what happens when we're ambivalent about sort of power structures and the hold that they have in sort of moving ideology, moving economics, moving just society at large, particularly with Muslims. So I think there's a very, very strong spatial component to it. I think there's an interesting historical point that could be mentioned right after sort of 9/11. Neo-traditionalist sheikhs were seen as this new liberal Islam, new modernizing force. The term traditionalism didn't really was something some people used, but it wasn't how the popular sort of American expert or policy advisor would have sort of positioned the sheikh's ideologies. They were something that was going to revive Muslims. It was going to harmonize it with sort of Americanism, with British values. And then things kind of changed. They weren't seen as liberal anymore, but still the idea that they were more at harmony with American and British values continued. And I think David Warren in his book makes this really beautiful point that I always go back to, is that sort of at that time in the early 2000s, there was this view of like the bad Islam as promoting conservative values. You know, these people were anti-feminist. These people didn't harmonize their Islam with liberal values, right? No. So the conservatism of elements of the Muslim community was seen as subversive and a threat to what it means to be an American or a British person. But now you have the opposite happening, where conservative values are seen as something that is an extension of a shared, moral spirit of the West in a way.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let's now go to Nicole's question. She said, Salam, Dr. Quisay. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Quisay, yeah.
Yeah. Walaikum salam. Congratulations on the publication of your book. I'm interested in how secrecy and secret knowledge is contributing to these sheikhs' authority and or abuse of authority. And then she had also a comment later on what you said about the metaphysical lens. She said also the metaphysical lens purpose you just described in the view of unjust authority is rooted in a Sunni logic, counter to the logics of the Shia community I study embedded post-Iranian revolution. You know what, when you were speaking, that famous line from Aqidah Tahawiyya came to my mind, you know, when it says, وَلَا نَرَى الْخُرُوجَ عَلَى أَئِمَّتِنَا وَلَاتِ أُمُورِنَا وَإِنْ جَارُوا. You know, we do not see that rebellion against our political leaders is permissible, even if they are, you know, grossly unjust. I'll translate jaru by grossly unjust. And I think for that reason also, just to build on Nicole's comment, the Iranian Revolution had quite a lot of influence, you know, among many Sunni Muslims also, because it sort of provided more agency to the people, in the sense that they could do something about the unjust condition they were living in. So there's just a comment on the comment, I guess. But back to the question, so secrecy, secret knowledge, and how it is contributing to the sheikh's authority and or abuse of authority. And then anything else that you would like to add?
Oh, yeah, this is a huge, huge, huge component, I think. And yeah, so thank you very much for bringing that up. The idea that the sheikhs have access to knowledge that certain people do not have, the fact that certain people believe that they were given special access to some of the knowledge empowers them in ways that it doesn't for others, but it really muddies the whole thing. I think so when I was doing my interviews, one of the people I spoke to had mentioned this sort of thing, quote or parable that a sheikh had mentioned to him, that this sheikh goes to a seeker and asks him to pour water into a cup. So the cup is sort of full, and he pours water and the water spills. So the sheikh says, you can't fill up, you can only fill up an empty cup. So there is this idea of like تخلية قبل التحلية, that you have to be emptied up in order to sort of build up these values, build up these beliefs. And the fact the sheikh's authority as being central to that is a very important part. I think one of the very interesting things that came up when people were first started discussing the peace forum, and it caused some controversy, is the idea that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya as a sage has access to knowledge and knows things that we do not know. So we have to trust that, you know, he knows what he's doing and why he's doing what he's doing. I think it's so very interesting, because in the political sense, it kind of robs you of your own agency to make up your mind as to what is the political imperatives. But even outside of that space of politics, what that really does allow for a lot of abuse of authority, and a lot of the cases of spiritual abuse that I've come to know of or have heard people talking about was this very utilization of secret knowledge. One of the people that I constantly refer to, Danish Qasim, who was the founder of In Sheikh's Clothing, he mentioned that there is the usage of the story of Khidr, you know, doing things that are outwardly objectionable, and Musa saying, you know, how could you do that? How could you kill a child? Why would you build up their houses when they haven't paid us? But then Khidr says, I know things that you do not know. And there's this usage of that story by some Sufi sheikhs that and others as well, you know, to say that we have access, like if something is objectionable, we have access to a secret knowledge that you don't. And so you end up in yourself, there is this sort of tension. Have I spiritually purified myself enough in order to trust the authorities that have access, our awliya? Is this a part of my bad nafs sort of moving me in ways that it shouldn't? So that's something that definitely comes up. In terms of whether, I mean, the second point is very hotly debated, even within scholars. I think the sort of quietist tendency exists within Sunnism, but I don't think it's necessarily always the only one. And quietism, it's the way that it's been employed by scholars in the past has been, maybe you can explain this a little bit better than I, but I think for some scholars, they stand in sort of neutral ground to the state and to the rebels. In some sense, sometimes there's an appeal to quietism that doesn't necessarily follow through. So it is a bit more of a complicated story there. But definitely within contemporary scholars, the debate, it's a very much debated issue. But then even if we put all of that to the side, right? We're talking about dissent in a Western context. Mm-hmm. None of these are awliya al-umur, but also if we think about the political happenings in the Middle East, what makes someone like Mohammed bin Zayed a wali for someone that is not from the United Arab Emirates? Like, why is this person the representative? Like, so even the appeals to this quietism, it doesn't necessarily, it's an appeal, but it doesn't logically make sense in a way.
It's a great point, actually. You're talking about, on the one hand, they are decrying transnational activism by, for instance, let's call them Islamist activists and so on, because if there is one thing that's worse than modernity, it's Islamists, clearly.
They are the inheritors of modernity.
Yeah, and because they're not only the inheritors, but they are also the corruptors of tradition. They are even worse than Western modernizers. But on the one hand, they are decrying this transnational activism, and on the other, they go to United Arab Emirates or Malaysia and they tell people, you have to stick with your government. You have to stick with, you cannot vote the government out. You should not go for the opposition. You should not do this and that. So it's very interesting, that certain type of transnational activism seems to be okay. It's just the question, what type of transnational activism?
Exactly. And you know what, something that, so there was this clip that I found very, very interesting when I was doing my research. And I think when I first approached Sheikh Hassan Shafi'i about the book, it's something that he caught onto. When Sheikh Hamza Yusuf went back to Mauritania 20 years later after he left, initially he was talking to the Mauritanians and saying, you guys are becoming seduced by modernity. I see TVs now in Mauritania. I see that you didn't have electricity, but now you do. This is sort of a corrupting force, and you shouldn't be like Syria. You shouldn't go against your leaders. You shouldn't. So there's this interesting sort of dimension of like, well, you're going to this country and you're telling these people how they shouldn't sort of act towards, but then also not knowing that the politics is so much more tumultuous than you actually understand. So it's a very, very, very fascinating point, to be honest.
Yeah, and then the next day you take a plane and you fly back to middle class suburban Californian neighborhood. It's interesting, but and I'm containing myself, as you can tell, because I want this to be about your book and the discussion about it. So so let's go back to the book. I have one more question, and then we have a couple more questions from the audience as well. So there seems to be a specific tension in neo-traditionalism. On the one hand, they're decrying Western modernity, but they also seem to be alarmed at the demise of Western Christianity and culture, and one can say, well, there is no contradiction there because they're talking about pre-modern Western Christianity and culture, but pre-modern Western Christianity and culture hasn't existed for 300 years, so really what they're talking about is the one that maybe was there when they were growing up, so it's kind of a thing that everybody, when they get a little bit older, they say, when I was growing up, things were a little bit different and they were better and so on. But then it seems to give it like theological kind of garb around it. So can you unpack this a little bit, this whole, what I think is a tension within neo-traditionalism,
Yeah. I think what was very, very interesting for me, so when I was going through the lectures that I think Dr. Omar and another lecture that Hamza Yusuf had sort of given, there was this figure that kept on popping up, and it's someone that I wasn't entirely familiar with, Richard Weaver. He has a book, Ideas Have Consequences. And I opened the book and the very first sentence is, this is another book about the decline of Western civilization. And that exemplified it for me. The book has several chapters where he, talks about nominalism as the beginning of the end, about the decline of aesthetics, how men are not men anymore, women are not women anymore. And then he has this one chapter called The Metaphysical Dream. And you can kind of see the beginnings of American conservatism in a nutshell. The metaphysical dream is the right to own property. And the right to own property is important because it's within the domain of a person's ownership of his land where these traditional values can stay. You know, you can homeschool your children can still like have these traditional values. You could still, you know, and it's just very, very interesting that when we think about the trope of civilizational crisis, the decline of Western civilization, it's a genre of literature within of itself. It's not something that we need to take for granted as there was a Western civilization that is in decline. It's discussions that happened after the Second World War. It's discussions that kind of were developed in the Cold War and continue to sort of take root in different ways. So one of the main claims is that, you know, that secularity came to be, and you know, people kind of lost their place in this modern world, right? And the problem with that is that prior to people fighting, prior to this crisis, that everyone lived in harmony. And my main problem with that, and I think what a lot of the seekers then kind of caught on to, is that, well, we weren't living in exact harmony in this pre-secular West. The Muslim figure was something that was very contested. Black people were enslaved, women didn't have any rights. So maybe it was good for some people. Maybe us not being in crisis was not harmony, but people being subjugated. So the story that you're trying to sell us is the story of a particular set of people having power over a particular set of land, and the values that were seemingly harmonious were actually something that was not necessarily harmonious for the majority of society. But this is where you have figures like Roger Scruton coming in and talking about aesthetics, and him seeing 1968 in Paris and lamenting, you know, how this beautiful France has been destroyed by the radicals. These appeals to beauty are very, very, very much political, and it goes, it places people in a narrative, or it displaces people in a narrative where they don't belong. And I think the point that was quite fascinating to me, I think Abdul Hakim Murad has a very much sustained kind of romanticism in which he sees, you know, this idyllic British countryside where, you know, the church was in charge and people believed and people had commitments and beauty existed, et cetera, et cetera. And this is something that was quite controversial in the book, but I mean, I don't feel like I am the one that brought up. It was something that was in his book about European Muslim values. The idea that the immigrants who, and he talks about this in the context of Britain, but also France, the immigrants who came into these lands came to a church-going society, but they didn't consult their spiritual leaders when they came. They came with a desire for worldly gain and wealth. And because they weren't oriented towards a spiritual cultivation, towards dawah, the crisis of identity that follows their grandkids is sort of endemic, right? And that's a very huge claim to make. The idea that, you know, the South Asian immigrants came into the UK wanting worldly gain. It's not just a strange claim. It's just historically inaccurate. You have a colonial power taking over parts of the world and then leaving it in disarray, partition happening, and people
But
not
that's
knowing.
victimization, right? If you talk about that, that's victimization, and Muslims should avoid that, right?
Yeah, and the fact that somehow a curse of a generation can follow like their children and their great children, their great grandchildren, rather than systematic political policies that ghettoize people in different. It's just it's not true, right? And then you have the reception of young people belonging to these communities of that kind of knowledge, and what happens is a very interesting process. For some people, it alienates them 100%. It really alienates them, and it causes a great sense of like burnout and disenchantment and what have you. But then with others, there's a sense of like, if I can be the bearer of this idyllic, triumphant Western narrative, then I can enact change. I don't have to be a subject of my identity. I can surpass my identity. But the problem is, even someone like Roger Scruton, who, meets sheikhs and stuff, he still sees you as a brown man. Like this is not something that's ever going to change. He still sees Muslims in the same way. He might like some aesthetic claims that certain traditionalist Muslims make about Islam, but he never liked Muslims. So that's the tension that people eventually have to contend with.
Yeah, and I think that goes to a lot of conservatives, right? That, some Muslims would like to align themselves now with who, may think they have some overlap in terms of values. But like you said, many of these people do not like Muslims and will never like Muslims, so it's very interesting kind of alignment or alliance. I think both are correct. We have Muhammad Ayub Khan. He had a couple of questions or comments. I think you actually answered some of this. He said, thanks for an excellent talk and book. I would appreciate if you can talk a little bit more on the concept of beauty in material terms as understood by three scholars under discussion. And then he said, following up on my last comment, I once heard Sheikh Hamza Yusuf describe a convention center in Chicago as ugly to make his point on the loss of beauty. I don't know if you want to comment on, because I think you talked about this idea of beauty and so on. So if you want, go ahead and then we can take another question that we have from Nicole again. Yeah.
I think one of the things that some of the alienated seekers had mentioned is this idea of like, if you come in here wearing jeans, this isn't the traditional way, that you need to, wear the beautiful vestments of, Islam, and that there is an inherent sort of class dimension to that is very, very important to note. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to clothing, it's a really good point, there, but because when you say like you have Muslim clothing, so which Muslim clothing are we talking about? From Indonesia, from Bangladesh, from Nigeria, from Mauritania, from Egypt, from Turkey? And what century are we talking about? Because Muslim clothes in 17th century is not the same as in the 19th or the 20th or 15th or 12th. There is this kind of timeless tradition that is being created and then projected to our contemporary time. I call that in my sort of thinking about this issue, I called it performative piety. There's a lot of performative piety. You have your incense, and then you have your candles, and then you have a certain garb, and you put certain things over your shoulder, and even kuhl may come into play. What's the kuhl in English?
Kuhl eyeliner,
eyeliner, mascara, I guess, one of those things. Yeah. and many of these things, and it's kind of like performative piety, because it's all that is just appearances, and again, what are you talking about, and when you're talking about it, when you talk about like, this is Muslim clothing, or this is how Muslims should dress, I mean, jeans is perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned, it's very comfortable, but that's just another discussion. Nicole has another question, which I think you touched upon quite a bit in your previous answer, but maybe if there is anything that you would like to add. She's asking, what do you make of these sheikhs aligning themselves with the conservative right, referencing Weaver and Peterson? And you start your book, I think, with references to Jordan Peterson's son, and what that means for upholding white supremacy. And this is really interesting, because very few people that they would reference are non-white. Almost all the people they are referencing, and they are looking as kind of examples of what Western society is, are white. So what does that mean? And also you talk in the book about a hierarchical approach within neo-traditionalism, which is exactly what these people are often referring to, the times before breakdown of values, when there were certain hierarchy, there were men on top, and then white men, and other people came under, and all of that. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think what Nicole is asking, and my kind of impromptu comments on it, if you could give some of your thoughts on that.
So there is a very, very obvious political dimension to it. There is a sort of cultural war, social dimension to it. And depending on where you stand politically, you might find it as sort of harmful or not harmful. But I think what was very, very, very interesting to me was when Mike Pompeo had his commission, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was a part of it. And he was talking, so what's fascinating about all of this is how some concerns come to be universalized and presented as a crisis when it wasn't necessarily inherently a crisis in our communities. So the question of abortion becomes a sort of important crisis that everyone needs to sort of focus on. And so there is an element of that, I think, in terms of particularly Hamza Yusuf and his connection with conservatives. The other political dimension to that, I think, was seen very, very succinctly within sort of the formation of the Forum for Promoting Peace. You have conservative figures who were concerned with sort of the position of the state of Israel in the Middle East. You have conservatives who were concerned with sort of the rise of the Muslim left or political Islam, and these things being very different, by the way. So there is a political project that is actually sponsored by state powers. So it's not just an ideological appeal or a social movement, but the social implication is equally troubling because, as we've all seen, there's a very, very significant rise of self-styled public intellectuals and pedagogues who sort of go on and on and on about, what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And a very, very, very sort of like troubling and kind of sexist discourse that is being disseminated as some sort of like intellectual critique that we need to contend with. And you see younger and younger people sort of falling into that, and it's sort of quite troubling. And when I was doing my PhD, Peterson came up a lot with the Seekers. I didn't think that it would go to the point where the sheikhs would be attracted to someone like Peterson, just because I saw him as someone who was a sort of cultural war crusader who has said some objectionable things about Islam, and that his intellectual approach wasn't entirely intellectual at all. But I was surprised, Abdul Hakim Murad discussed him in his book. Hamza Yusuf had a podcast with him, and it was fascinating that like a couple of weeks later, Peterson met Netanyahu and was still saying all these objectionable things about Islam, when a lot of the young people that were following this were expecting him to give the shahada like a week later, and that didn't happen. But yeah, the impact on our community is quite noticeable and quite disturbing. I think something that this is a personal reflection. It isn't something that like is intellectual in any way. But I remember growing up and being in my father's sort of library and going through books and stuff, and a lot of stuff that I was reading I didn't understand. But there was a particular publishing house that I think came out of Beirut, and they had the phrase that they began each book with, and I didn't know why they would, النساء شقائق الرجال. And so Malik bin Nabi's books would have that, Miseri's books would have that. And these were the people that I grew up reading. And even it was definitely not an idyllic time to be a woman, but there was this sense that there's this shared project, and that both men and women were like equal participants in this project. So even if you have people that were conservative and believed that a woman's place was at home, they believed that a woman's place was at home in order to build something, in order to rectify the ummah, in order to do blah, blah, blah. But there was a sense that there was this intrinsic value, that I, as a young woman, felt like, okay, I am a part of this bigger thing. I'm a part, but for me, it's troubling that doesn't exist anymore, right? There is a sense that women are this seditious element of society. They are more entranced by modernity. And so the breakdown of values will come through women. And it's so embedded within sort of the discourse that people don't even see it anymore, that there's this inherent belief. And even when people come sometimes to talk about my work, I kind of see it. There's a sense that it's entirely racist, but there's a sense that you're a woman, you can't be possibly comfortable with Islam. And so any critique that you would have of any elements of anything to do with our culture, tradition, or even commentary must come from a position of wanting to break down. And so that, I think, has become such a harmful but such a powerful claim that exists in social media, in sort of the intellectual sphere. And it's genuinely very troubling.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're coming almost to an end of our allocated time, and this actually has been a longer conversation, book talk, than probably one of the longest. And it just shows how interesting the book is and how much there is in it to unpack. But I would like to end with this question, because there is one thing that I really want to discuss with you, and I'm sure our audience would find it interesting too. And that is the issue of the palace Islam, Sufism, and the Arab Spring. They feature prominently in your book, and we have only about 5 minutes left, and I know that's not enough time, but obviously this is just to sort of give the basic ideas from your book, and hopefully people will read it and get more out of it. But what are the roles, or what is the role that neo-traditionalists play in this constellation, with palace Islam and Sufism, and then the Arab Spring, when a lot of masks have fallen, as we know?
Yeah, so very, very briefly, I think, so this chapter looked at particularly the role of the United Arab Emirates and to some extent Saudi Arabia, but it featured primarily the United Arab Emirates. And I think it goes back to the very first point that I made. The state and the state power structures have a singular belief, and that is themselves, their survival, right? So even though the modern or the United Arab Emirates under the control of Mohammed bin Zayed has sort of sponsored different Sufi groups, whether it's Habib Ali Jifri or others, it's not necessary. They're not practitioners. They're not necessarily believers. And it's very evident from the different types of people that are sort of sponsored through the state Islam. You have a group, an Arab group called Al-Mu'minun Bila Hudud, and that's a primarily postmodernist sort of approach to Islam. But then also you have the very structure of society there, you know, it's a secularizing society. They changed the weekend, so Friday is no longer the weekend. It's a deeply modernist state. So the idea that traditionalism as an ideology has an impact is not necessarily something that is true. But the role that it plays is perpetuating the bad versus good Islam, where the UAE sees itself as a UAE, and in extension, by the way, different dictatorial regimes. I don't want to sort of understress how important the role the UAE has taken in promoting dictatorship all around the world, not just in the Arab world, and promoting surveillance of everyone. This idea that tasawwuf represents tolerance, represents beauty, represents a spiritual but inadvertently harmless religion in the face of an other that is terrifying, that is Islamist, that is scary. But then even when we go to look at who they would see and put within that sphere of Islamism, it is anyone who has any political orientation or anything to say against sort of dictatorial control. So Islamism becomes this term that is thrown around to criminalize dissent. And by the way, when we think about dissent within the Gulf context, it's not what we think of dissent in other contexts. It's very, very, very moderate, a form of critique, very, very soft critique. But even that space is not allowed. So that's a part of the role that it plays. And then you have the promotion of Abrahamic values, which is something that we could have discussed, like it would have been interesting to discuss a little bit more, but the sort of shared Abrahamic values were a precursor, in my belief, to the Abraham Accords. It gives it a form of theological cushioning. So that's sort of the role. So even if certain figures within these trends did not necessarily want that to be the inevitable sort of repercussion, the state shapes ideology in its own image. So tradition will have to be shaped by the imperatives of modern power in the end. And that's sort of what I claim in that chapter. And then you have, it's interesting because when Hamza Yusuf starts talking about the Alliance of Virtue and other initiatives that Sheikh bin Bay sort of starts in the UAE, he calls him a creative traditionalist, which is another term for doing exactly the same thing that other people have done, but in service of power, not going against it.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that they would lend support and align themselves with countries that are hyper-modernizing at the same time, and while they are critiquing modernity and seeing it as one of the great evils. Well, it is 1:30 over here, and so we're out of our time, but I wanted to thank you for this fabulous conversation. I think our audience can see that there is so much in the book, and I can tell you we've only touched like certain small aspects of the book. There is much more in the book, but that's all we could do in about an hour and a half. So I hope that you will read it. In case you haven't, I believe Edinburgh University Press on their website, they have PDF for free right now. So anyone can, and I have provided in the chat the link to the book, so anyone can download the book for free and read it. It's well worth your time, let me say that. And once again, Dr. Walaa, thank you so much for being with us and for discussing your book.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
You're most welcome. And thank you also to our audience for staying with us. And inshallah, we have 2 more book talks coming up this semester. We have Hafsa Kwanjal, who's going to talk about Kashmir and the Indian colonial state. And then we have Tazeen Ali, who's going to talk about her book on Women's Mosque of America. You can find more information at our website, which is contemporaryislam.org, contemporaryislam.org. You'll find more information. You can register for the book talk, and you will get the link, inshallah. So once again, thank you. Wassalamu alaikum, and have a great day.